Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. We're having a very diverse group today. We're having some university professors and we have some long-term practitioners, but we also have quite a few newbies. So I know that for some of you, today might be the first time that you actually read an early Buddhist text. So today is just the introduction. I'm going to talk about the general background, about the origin of our texts, and about a little bit of the historical background, how texts developed. So we're not going to talk about any specific ancient nuns, any specific theories today. And I see people are still joining slowly, one by one, so that's very good. I'm going to start with the presentation now, and hopefully definitely there will be time for question and answer at the end. And I will share my screen. So, as I just mentioned, for some reason, I still see Sabamita instead of myself. So I don't know what's going on there. Very strange. Anyway, let's just get started. Today, as I just mentioned, we're talking about the origin and the development of our text. And I very much hope that we will have the time to read an abbreviated version of the story of the first council. And the first council in Pali is called the first Sangiti, often also translated as the Communal Recitation. And that is an event in Buddhist history that took place very shortly after the Buddha's Parinibbana. And this was a group, the tradition says 500 monks, 500 Arahant monks, all of them male monks, so bhikkhunīs and women were not represented in the first council, who came together to collect the Buddha's teaching and make sure that it is preserved for the future generations. And because of the structure of how this first council was held, that had a huge impact on how the women's stories and women's voices were preserved in the tradition. So I'm very much hoping that we will read, we'll have the time to read that today. I think we should have. And if there's more time, we are also going to read a short extract from the Mahāpajāpatī Apadāna. An Apadāna is a legend. So this is a legend about the life of Mahāpajāpatī Gotami. And so the texts we will work with in our course are, I've put them here in order of historical date. So the first ones, the foundational ones, of course, are the Suttas, also called sutras or discourses, from collections that are called in Pali the 4 Nikayas. In Sanskrit and in Chinese are called the agamas. But that is just, somebody else is joining, sorry. That is just another word for the same thing. So we have the Digha Nikaya, the Majjhima Nikaya, the Samyutta Nikaya, the Anguttara Nikaya, and the parallels in the agamas. People who are familiar with the Sutra Pitaka know that I've just left out the Khuddaka Nikaya, the 5th Nikaya, because that is not a text from the earliest time of Buddhism. The majority of content in the Khuddaka Nikaya actually developed at a later time. But one collection that is there and that is very, very important for our course are the Therīgāthā verses. So we have just had the Therīgāthā festival. So I'm assuming that most people would be familiar with the word. The Therīgāthā are verses of the senior nuns, the bhikkhunīs at the Buddha's time. And this is a collection that is hugely important for women in Buddhism, because this is almost the only collection we have where we have women's voices being preserved, where we have the actual women's perspective on and their description of how they experience their life, how they practice, how the living situations they are in, and their description of their environment and how they all attained enlightenment. So this is very, very different from the vast majority of the rest of the suttas, because those, as I just mentioned, were collected by monks. So we have a male perspective on the women, but we don't really have the women's own voices. And because of the way the suttas were collected, we actually have many thousands of suttas preserved from the Buddha and from the early disciples, but the vast majority of these suttas were spoken by men, and the discourses spoken by women weren't actually preserved because they were not represented in the first council. So of the thousands of suttas that we have in the Sutta Pitaka, we have less than 20 where women actually play any kind of major role. So there are very, very few suttas that portray the women's own voices, but in the Therīgāthā verses we have that, and that's why it's so hugely important to understand the situation there. And the next text we are going to work with are the Vinaya texts. And Vinaya is the Pali and Sanskrit name for the monastic law, so the rules that bhikkhus and bhikkhunīs keep. And those Vinaya texts have evolved over a very long period of time, definitely several centuries. So there is a core material in the Vinaya, mostly the bare bone rules themselves and a few of the monastic procedures that were very likely laid down by the Buddha himself. So they go back to the Buddha's lifetime. But those rules are nowadays embedded in other material, kind of like an early commentary that explains the origin of the rule. There's an origin story that explains a situation, this and this happened, a monk or nun misbehaved and people were upset, and then a rule was laid down, and there are case studies, and there are word definitions and exceptions and many other stories. So the Vinaya we have nowadays is a lot more than just the rules, and that has developed over a long period of time. And we know that it has developed over a long period of time because these Vinaya collections are preserved until today in different versions, each belonging to a different school of Buddhism. And we know that those schools came into being a few centuries after the Buddha. So in the early period of Buddhism, the sangha was still united, and then after a while, differences emerged, and the united sangha broke into several schools. Tradition says 18 schools. So all those schools inherited the material that was there before them, like the very early material, but then they all developed it into their own directions. So by comparing all this, we can see regional differences. We can also see what is comparatively older, what is comparatively newer. And because all the rules have origin stories, we can also see the living conditions of nuns at different times, at different points in time. So the Vinayas will be very important also for our course. And we're also going to work with what is called apadānas. So those are legends of the Buddha and his early disciples, his early monk and nun disciples. So those apadānas also developed over many centuries after the Buddha's time. And we can see a very clear difference, for example, when we will compare Therīgāthā verses from the earliest period with the apadānas that came into being at a later time. And apadānas are usually very much embellished stories. They contain a lot of miracles, a lot of supernatural elements, and yeah, something that we will work with also in our course. And lastly, we are going to work with the commentaries. In the Pali tradition, the most famous commentaries are the ones that were written by a monk called Buddhaghosa. And he came from India to Sri Lanka in around 420 CE. And he wrote the commentaries after that. So that is roughly 1,000 years after the Buddha. So when we read the commentaries, we have a glimpse into a text that was written at an even later date, so 1,000 years after the Buddha. And of course, Buddhaghosa didn't completely make up the commentary. He based his work on earlier works. So again, there is a continuity there. But anyway, we will see how Buddhaghosa related to women at this later point in time. And just have to get some water. I also want to talk a little bit about the women in the text. Of course, this is something we are going to explore in this course. So I just want to give a brief introduction. So what we are going to see is that in the Buddha's lifetime, women had relative freedom. There were thriving female renunciate movements at the Buddha's time. So around the Buddha, there were other renunciate movements. Buddhism wasn't the only religion that was practiced at the time. And most of those movements, or all, maybe most, had female sanghas, so that women practicing as renunciates in those movements. For example, our texts mention female Jains, female Ajivakas, also female wanderers that were unaffiliated with any movement, so they were just independent and did their own thing. The Therīgāthā, in the Therīgāthā, women tell us that they were practicing Brahmin rituals before they converted to Buddhism. So that's very interesting, because in the centuries after that, in Brahmanism, women were no longer able to practice the rituals on their own. They had to rely on men to carry out rituals for them. But at that time, women still tell us that they did the rituals themselves. So that's very interesting. We know we have a sutta that tells us of a female Brahmin teacher teaching male students, and we have to assume in the sacred knowledge of the Brahmins, the Vedas. So that sutta is attested in the Pali tradition, in Sanskrit, and in Chinese. So we're very well attested across different schools. We have constantly mentions of women that were head of households. We have a mention of the famous laywoman Visakha, who had a court case and was dealing directly with King Pasenadi. So definitely women could also represent themselves in court. And generally the environment was quite favorable for women. And so sometimes it is said that when we look at our texts and we see that you know, the Buddha supposedly placed all kinds of restrictions on the female sangha and subordinated them to the monks, the justification that is given for that is often, oh, well, because it was so unusual for the Buddha's time and there was no other sangha and he did such a radical thing, that's why he had to put all these restrictions in place, because otherwise nobody would have accepted it. Actually, when we look at the early texts, that is not at all what we see. We see a lot of very independent women and a lot of other female renunciate movements. So this is one very interesting difference that we are going to see when we compare earlier texts with later texts. And then after the Buddha's lifetime, as I mentioned, the first council, the first Sangiti, happened. A group of male monks came together and collected the teachings. The Dhamma, the sutras, and the Vinaya. So to preserve it for later generations. So that was obviously a very important thing to do. And I think every Buddhist has a huge gratitude to the First Council for doing that. So when later we are examining the narrative of the First Council in a critical way, that I still want to say first that, you know, all Buddhists should be hugely grateful to the First Council for doing the work that they did. But of course, women are not represented in the First Council, so the texts of women were not collected in the First Council. So whatever sutras the Buddha gave to the female sangha, or whatever sutras women, bhikkhunīs, gave to each other, or maybe to monks, or maybe to lay people, are not collected except for a very, very small amount, as I mentioned before, less than 20 sutras. And we will also see that monks who are supporting the bhikkhunīs are censured in the First Council, and they receive pressure from the other monks. So what seems evident when we look at the narrative of the First Council is that in the early Sangha, after the Buddha's passing, there were tensions, there were different streams, different groups, and they were a little bit struggling with each other to determine the future course that the Sangha should take. And on the one side, there is a group that is usually associated with Mahāpajāpatī. And Mahāpajāpatī is well known for being a very ascetic monk, being very reclusive, also being very strict, and for being very critical of bhikkhunīs and of women. And on the other hand, there is a group associated with Ananda usually. And Ananda is well known to be very approachable, also fairly close to lay people, so not very reclusive. And he also is well known to be a strong supporter of the bhikkhunīs. So we see that those two groups had some tensions between them. And in the First Council, we see that the groups around Mahāpajāpatī apparently prevailed over the Ananda group. And what that means for women is something that we can also explore. And that's why I think it's worth really spending time today focusing on the narrative of the First Council. So because Mahāpajāpatī prevailed in the First Council, and because he was a promoter of very strict practice, there was a period where the Vinaya was developed a lot and where it became much tighter, where a lot of new rules were laid down. And especially a lot of rules were also laid down or maybe imposed on the female Sangha, which is also something that we are going to explore in this course. And probably that wasn't only because some parts of the male Sangha were we're not very happy with having the bhikkhunīs around. It very well could also reflect a general development in the society at that time. As I mentioned, things also got difficult for women in other religions and for women in society in general. We know that, for example, from the Brahmin tradition. So it's possible that the additional Vinaya rules that were imposed on women could also reflect that women in society in general had a lower status in the decades and centuries after the Buddha's passing. But we also know that in India, traditionally, there wasn't given that much value to historical accuracy. So the additional Vinaya rules that were put into place were ascribed to the Buddha. So in the text, it seems like the Buddha himself lays down those rules. And of course, that is a means to authenticate the rules and to make sure that nobody questions them. And of course, nobody can question the Buddha because he is the fully awakened Arahant and the founder and leader of our religion. So if we think that all the rules were laid down by the Buddha, then of course we have no leeway to later again discuss them and abolish them or modify them. So once rules were there that explicitly said that women have to bow to men, bhikkhunīs have to bow to bhikkhus, and made it very clear that there is no gender equality in the sangha, then those kind of attitudes continued throughout the centuries and throughout the millennia, and we can still very, very clearly see that until now. So as a bhikkhuni, because I live this lifestyle, I experience this literally all the time. So definitely these ancient texts continue to have a very strong influence on Buddhists and Buddhist societies, even in the modern day. So now I would like to move on to read with you the story of the first council. And we are going to use the account that is given in the Pali tradition. And we find very similar stories about the first council in all Vinaya traditions. But I'm reading the Pali version with you today because it's the easiest accessible version, and there are lots of translations. So it's the easiest also to read. And if there's time, as I mentioned before, we are going to read the Mahāpajāpatī Apadāna as well. So hopefully you can see this now. This is the text, which says the origin account of the communal recitation. So communal recitation, as I mentioned before, is another name for the first council. Then the Venerable Mahākassapa addressed the monks. On one occasion, I was traveling from Pava to Kusinara. Kusinara is the place where the Buddha attained parinibbana, with a large sangha of 500 monks. And I left the road and sat down at the foot of a tree. Just then, a follower of the Ajīvakas was traveling towards Pava on the same road. The Ajīvakas is another renunciate movement, a non-Buddhist movement. So just another religious wanderer. So he was traveling on the same road, holding a coral tree flower that he had picked up in Kusinara. When I saw him coming, I asked him, "Do you know anything about our teacher?" "I do. Today it's 7 days since the ascetic Gautama, that is the Buddha, attained final extinguishment. That's why I carry this coral tree flower." So I have slightly abbreviated the text here, and these ... just says that all the arahants were equanimous, and everybody who was not an arahant was grieving and lamenting. On that occasion, a monk called Subhadda, who had gone forth when old, was part of that group. He said to the monks, "Please stop grieving, stop lamenting. It's good that we are freed from that great ascetic. We were oppressed, always being told what's allowable and what isn't. Now we can do what we like and not do what we don't like." So Subhadda is rejoicing that the Buddha has passed away. And of course, Mahākassapa is greatly alarmed. And he says, "So then, let's recite the teaching, that is the sutras, and the monastic law, the Vinaya, together before what is contrary to the teaching shines forth and the teaching is obstructed. Before what is contrary to the monastic law shines forth and the monastic law is obstructed. Before those who speak contrary to the teaching become strong, and those who speak in accordance with it become weak. Before those who speak contrary to the monastic law become strong, and those who speak in accordance with it become weak." So Mahākassapa organizes the first council with the express purpose to preserve the Dhamma and the Vinaya, so that there is one version that is authenticated by the tradition, and later generations will know what is the true Dhamma and what isn't. And I think it's clear that if the first council had not happened, and if we hadn't had these collections of texts then I think definitely it would have been, the Dhamma would have been lost quite quickly. Because, I mean, you need a very concerted effort to preserve this large amount of text. So huge depth of gratitude of all Buddhists to the first council, I think. So anyway, the text continues. Well then, Venerable, please select the monks. Mahākassapa then selected 499 perfected ones, that means arahants, and the monks said to him, there is Venerable Ananda, who, although still a trainee, is incapable of acting from desire, ill will, confusion, or fear. He has learned many teachings and much monastic law in the presence of the Buddha. Please invite him as well. And he did. So this paragraph here, I think, is included to already tell us that Mahākassapa was kind of hesitant to include the Venerable Ananda in the first council. So we can already sense that there are some tensions between Mahākassapa and Ananda. Because other monks had to actually explicitly ask him to invite the Venerable Ananda to the council. And in the texts of other schools, this is even more explicit. So in those texts, sometimes the monks really have to pressure Mahākassapa and ask him over and over until he finally includes Venerable Ananda. So the senior monks then went to Rajagaha to recite the teaching and the monastic law. And you can see I've again left out a small portion. This is where the monks do repairs and make preparations. And then the Venerable Ananda thought, it would not be proper for me to go to the assembly tomorrow if I'm still a trainee. That means he's still a stream enterer, he's not an arahant. And after spending most of the night with mindfulness directed to the body, early in the morning, he bent over to lie down. In the interval between his feet coming off the ground, oh, somebody else is joining. Coming off the ground and his head hitting the pillow, his mind was freed from the corruptions without grasping. And Venerable Ananda went to the assembly as a perfected one. And then Venerable Mahākassapa informed the sangha. Please, I ask the sangha to listen. If it seems appropriate to the sangha, I will ask Upali about the monastic law. Venerable Upali informed the sangha. Please, Venerables, I ask the sangha to listen. If it seems appropriate to the sangha, I will reply when asked by Venerable Mahākassapa about the monastic law. In this way, he asked about the analysis of both monastic codes, and Upali was able to reply to every question. So here we see how they collected the monastic law, the Vinaya. And as we see, the bhikkhunīs were not represented, but their monastic code was recited. So both monastic codes means the rules of the monks and the rules of the nuns. And up until today, we can still see in the structure of the Vinaya this exact division that was done in the first council, and the fact that women were not represented there is also very clear in the Vinaya. So when we look at the Vinaya, the part that is for monks is a complete text where every single rule is explained in much detail, and the part for the nuns is very much incomplete. So monks and nuns have a very large number of rules that they share in common, and then each sangha also has rules that are separate only for them. And the part in the Vinaya that is for the bhikkhunīs only has those rules that are specific for them. And when we want to look up things about all the other rules, the rules that we share with the bhikkhus, then we have to go to the bhikkhu texts and look them up there. And of course, then the rules are phrased from a male perspective. And usually that's not a big problem because we can just substitute the genders and then we know what the rule is about. But there are some rules where that's not really possible because men and women are just different and their anatomy is different and some other things are also different. So sometimes the explanation doesn't really match for the bhikkhunīs. so we end up with rules that don't have a proper explanation for us. So that is a very big lack that we still feel until today. And also because bhikkhunīs were not there and because they did not recite their own monastic code, the monks recited rules that they weren't really practicing. So they didn't really have that much knowledge about them. And so the explanations we have about our rules are very, very much shorter and very much superficial and very incomplete compared to the monks. And we also have some rules that are really strange, where we can clearly see that celibate male monks preserved them because they describe very strange things about female anatomy, for example. So as a woman, we immediately know that this cannot possibly be true. But we clearly see that a woman could never have phrased or formulated the text as we have it now. So up until today, we see what happened in the first council represented in our text. And also we can clearly see that even over the next few centuries, when the Vinaya evolved and developed and broke into different schools, and we compare the versions of the different schools, the rules of the monks are very, very similar. We can almost say identical. And the rules of the nuns have quite a big variance. So clearly there was a lot less care for the nuns' rules. And yeah, that is in part due to the structure of the first council. Anyway, moving on, the Venerable Mahākassapa informed the Sangha. Please, I ask the Sangha to listen. If it seems appropriate to the Sangha, I will ask Ananda about the teaching, that is the sutras. Venerable Ananda informed the Sangha. Please, Venerables, I ask the Sangha to listen. If it seems appropriate to the Sangha, I will reply when asked by Venerable Mahākassapa about the teaching. In this way, he recited about the 5 collections. In this way, he asked about the 5 collections. And Ananda was able to reply to every question. So Ananda, according to tradition, Ananda single-handedly recited the almost the entire Sutra Pitaka. So here are the 5 collections I mentioned, which are the 5 Nikayas or Agamas. As I said before, at the point of the first council, only the first 4 collections were probably sort of complete, and the 5th collection was in a very preliminary state with only a very small number of texts in there. And nowadays it is actually the biggest of the 5 Nikayas, because a lot of later texts were added. Anyway, at that point, the council normally should have ended because it was done for the purpose of reciting Dhamma and Vinaya, and that's what they did. But Ananda then says to the monks, at the time of his final extinguishment, the Buddha said to me, after my passing away, Ananda, if the Sangha wishes, it may abolish the lesser training rules. But Ananda, did you ask the Buddha which are the lesser training rules? No, I didn't. Some senior monks said, apart from the 4 rules entailing expulsion, the rest are the lesser training rules. Others said, apart from the 4 rules entailing expulsion and the 13 rules entailing suspension, the rest are the lesser training rules. And again, I've put ... here because now a lot of monks speak up and everybody makes different suggestions what are the lesser training rules. And it's a long paragraph, so I have left that out. The Venerable Mahākassapa informed the Sangha. Please, I ask the Sangha to listen. If it seems appropriate to the Sangha should not lay down new rules, nor get rid of the existing ones, and it should undertake to practice the training rules as they are. The Sangha approves and is therefore silent. I will remember it thus. So because the monks cannot agree which ones are the minor rules, they just decide to keep all the rules, but they also make an explicit decision not to lay down new rules. And that's very interesting because as we will see, this decision wasn't even kept for 5 minutes. And we also know that throughout the centuries, the Vinaya evolved to a great extent, and a lot of new rules were added actually. But it's interesting that they actually made this decision not to lay down new rules that is expressly mentioned here in the text. And then suddenly the senior monks all turn against Ananda and start to accuse him of all sorts of things. So what then happens is the senior monks said, "You have committed an act of wrong conduct, Ananda, in that you didn't ask the Buddha which are the lesser training rules. Confess that wrong conduct." And Ananda says, "It was because of lack of mindfulness that I didn't ask which are the lesser training rules. I can't see that I have committed any wrong conduct, but I'll confess it out of faith in the venerables." So we see that even though the monks just decided not to lay down new rules, they're coming up with a new rule that it is an offense that people don't ask Buddhas about lesser training rules, which obviously is not a rule that is found anywhere in the Vinaya. That's just something that came up at that point. And they say it's a rule that needs to be confessed, or an offense that needs to be confessed. And Ananda says, well, I cannot see that offense. I don't think I did anything wrong. But he doesn't want to have a big conflict with the rest of the Sangha, so he's just confessing it, even though he doesn't see the offense. And again, that's something that's actually normally not possible in the Vinaya. In the Vinaya, you can only confess an offense if you actually see that you have done something wrong. So this whole procedure is quite strange, what's going on here. And what seems to be going on here is that well, Ananda just recited the entire Sutra Pitaka, so he's obviously an extremely learned monk. He has also lived with the Buddha as his attendant for 25 years. He's also an arahant now, so it would seem quite natural for the Sangha to turn towards Ananda for guidance at this point in time when the Buddha has passed away. But of course, as I mentioned before, there were tensions and there were different groups in the Sangha. So the monks in the Mahākassapa group are now trying to show that Ananda is not actually a suitable guide or a suitable person to rely on, because he has all those faults and because he has committed all kinds of offenses. So they're kind of trying to undermine Ananda's credibility. That it seems what is going on here. And then they accuse him of different things, and then they accuse him that he stepped on the Buddha's rainy season robe when he was sewing it. And again, Ananda says, I don't see that offense, but I'll confess it. And again, that's a rule that was just made up. There is no rule in the Vinaya that says you cannot step on rainy season robes. Actually, it happens all the time when we sew robes, then people step on it because robes are just huge. And they need a lot of space, and usually kutis are small. So when you walk around, you kind of step on robes while you sew it. So that's entirely normal in the Sangha. So that's kind of a little bit of a weird thing here. But again, this is just to show that Ananda doesn't have the proper respect for Buddha and Buddhism in general, so shouldn't be taken as a leader. And then things get interesting, because the senior monks say, you have also committed an act of wrong conduct in that you had women pay respect to the Buddha's dead body first. They soiled the Buddha's body with tears, confess that wrong conduct. And Ananda says, I did this so that it wouldn't get too late for them. I can't see that I've committed any wrong conduct, but I'll confess it out of faith in the venerables. So now there's quite open misogyny here in the text, quite open hostility towards women, or maybe not hostility, but quite an open expression that's to say that women and men are not equal, and it's not acceptable that women go first when the men should have gone first. And Ananda doesn't share that position at all. He doesn't at all see the problem with doing that. He says he acted out of compassion, so it wouldn't get too late for them. But anyway, again, he confesses. He submits and confesses. And then they accuse him of another thing. He didn't ask the Buddha to live on for an eon. And again, Ananda says he doesn't see the offense, but he will confess it again. And then finally, the last point is, you have committed an act of wrong conduct in that you made an effort for women to be given the going forth on the spiritual path proclaimed by the Buddha. Confess that wrong conduct. And so here we see that the group around Mahākassapa is really upset that bhikkhunīs exist, that there are women in the sangha. Women should never have been given the going forth. That was a mistake that Ananda made, an offense, and now Ananda is made to confess an offense for having made it possible for women to go forth. And this, with this note, on this note, the first council concludes. And there is a small passage that follows it that is also interesting for us. And that reads, at the time, Venerable Purana was wandering in the southern hills with a large sangha of 500 monks. So that means Purana had a very large following. He was probably a fairly influential monk at that time. When the senior monks had concluded the communal recitation of the teaching and the monastic law, and when Purana had stayed in the southern hills for as long as he liked, he went to the bamboo grove at Rajagaha. There he approached the senior monks, exchanged pleasantries with them, and sat down. And they said to him, Purana, the senior monks have jointly recited the teaching and the monastic law. Please accept that communal recitation. But Purana says, well, the teaching and the monastic law have been well recited by the senior monks. Nevertheless, I will remember what I myself have received in the presence of the Buddha. So Purana says, well, that's nice what you just did, but I am not going to submit to your version. I don't think that's authentic. I will keep following what I myself have heard from the Buddha, which implies obviously that there is a discrepancy and that he has heard something that was different from what was recited in the first council. And that then shows that there was no consensus in the early sangha. And again, it shows us that there were different groups and everybody was still trying to find their way. And not everybody accepted the version that the first council produced as authentic. So here I put a link. I will put that in the chat later on. So if people want to read the whole story without all the dots, you can look it up yourself. It's freely available. And I think at this point in time, we're not going to read the Mahāpajāpatī Apadāna anymore, but I just want to say a few words about it. So in the Mahāpajāpatī Apadāna, well, as I mentioned, Apadānas are later legends. They evolved a long time after the life of the actual Mahāpajāpatī. But it's quite common that those legends have a historical core that is then greatly embellished, but that there is some historical truth to some of the stories in the Apadānas. And what we read in the Mahāpajāpatī Apadāna is that when Mahāpajāpatī heard that the Buddha was about to pass away, she decided that she would pass into parinibbana first. And then the 500 nuns who were around Mahāpajāpatī all also decided that they would pass away together with Mahāpajāpatī. And then a large group of nuns led by the chief nun, the female chief nun Khema. She was the female counterpart to Sariputta, the foremost in wisdom, the nun foremost in wisdom. And her large following, which included probably other teachers, also decided that they would all pass away into parinibbana before the Buddha goes. And if there is some historical truth to this, then that means that at the time of the first council, the female sangha would have been very, very greatly diminished. And all their leaders and teachers and guides would have gone, and also a large number of just the ordinary nuns would have gone. So it's possible that at the time of the first council, the female sangha was in quite a weak state. And that might be another reason why the texts of the nuns weren't well preserved. Mm-hmm. And then, as we have seen, there were tensions in the male sangha concerning the role of the female sangha. So in the decades and centuries after the Buddha's passing, the female sangha became a political matter in the male sangha because because of those different groups, and those different groups kind of trying to guide the sangha in different directions. And once the female sangha became political for the male sangha, of course, it was very much more difficult for the women to preserve an independence and to do their own thing. So at this point, I would like to end my presentation and open up for question and answers. And if anybody has any comments or questions or anything they want to share, then you can either type in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask. Just speak, whatever you're comfortable with. Anna-Marie is raising her hand, so if you like, you can speak.
Thank you, Aya. Thank you so much. It's really, really interesting. What comes to my mind is the monks at the first council, they were all arahants, yet at least some of them, I'm trying to match the arahant with misogyny. Or is it, if my understanding of an arahant would be that their only motivation could be like a loving one, or is that a misunderstanding?
Yeah, that's definitely a very good question, and something that many people have struggled with and are still struggling with, I think, even today, because even today they are very accomplished teachers that we consider very accomplished, and who also have opinions that are very similar to what we see in the first council narrative. So yeah, it's difficult to reconcile. And as we have seen at the Buddha's time, the Buddha didn't really have these kind of opinions. When we read the very early text, he created very favorable conditions for the bhikkhunī sangha. So yeah, what's going on? I also don't have a definite conclusion. But one thing also to keep in mind is that these are texts, and the texts were obviously written after the fact. So the narrative of the first council was included into the canon at the second council, which happened 100 years afterwards. So they didn't immediately preserve a version of what happened at the first council. During the first council, they just sort of kept on telling the story until it was finally 100 years later included into the canon. So what we have just read is what the tradition wanted to preserve about the first council. It doesn't mean that that actually happened at the first council. So we don't know who the monks are that composed those texts. We don't know if they were all arahants. It's just maybe just an opinion that was prevalent in the sangha at the time of the second council. That is a possibility. Other than that, yeah, it's difficult. I also find it very hard to reconcile. Yeah, Vanessa?
Hi.
Hi.
That was a beautiful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
You did that very skillfully. You definitely made your case very well. You did. So I guess the obvious question that comes with all of this is that if we're going to start asking the kinds of questions that you're asking, which we've been doing for a very long time, of was this written at the Buddha's time? What is not written at the Buddha's time? What is produced by monks later for their own political agendas? Once we start down that road, it requires a tremendous amount of sophistication to stay on that road without the whole system collapsing. Because we don't actually know which parts were said by the Buddha and which weren't. And so once we start allowing ourselves to open that door, how do you, I think you're right to ask all these questions. I've been thinking about them for many years, but I just wonder if you have an answer as to how do you keep the tradition without it collapsing once we start those questions. It's much easier to be a fundamentalist, in other words, right? Because we just say, it's all from the Buddha, I'll follow all of it and I won't ask any questions. But now we're asking questions, we're saying, well, this might not have been written by the Buddha, and this might not even been written by Mahākassapa. And right, once we start, how do you manage that road? I don't even know if there's an answer to that question, but it's definitely a challenging situation to be in.
So for me personally, it's very important to make a distinction between what is the actual teaching of the Buddha and what was added later, because I'm a Buddhist nun. I've dedicated my life to practicing the Buddha's teaching, and I want to practice what the Buddha actually taught, because I think that is my best shot at actually developing on the path and not getting sidetracked, because what was written later is something that I can't have the same faith in it, because people who wrote stuff later, they might have been enlightened, they might not have been enlightened. So for me, it's very, very important to make that distinction between what the Buddha taught and what he didn't teach. And I think there are quite, as you say, research has been going on now for quite a while, for more than a century in the Western countries, and probably similar questions have been raised in Asia for a longer time. So, I mean, throughout the last 2,500 years, similar questions have been asked. And I think criteria have been established to say which texts are very likely authentic and which texts are very likely inauthentic. So, for example, through comparative studies, we can already exclude a huge amount of texts, because if they are all different in the different schools of Buddhism, then it seems very, very likely that they have developed at a later date. And then through textual analysis, we can also see which texts are earlier, which texts are later. Also, by studying, as we are doing now, by studying the background stories, we can see at which historical point in time this story was set. So we can see if the stories match a society that obviously describes a later point in history, then that must be a later text. So I think there are quite a number of criteria. I'm not an expert in that. I just have some superficial knowledge of that, but there are definitely quite a number of criteria to establish which texts are early and which texts are late. And so we can actually say with a relative high certainty which texts are very likely authentic and which aren't. And I know that is very challenging for the tradition. That is definitely hugely challenging for the tradition. And of course, there is a very strong belief in many traditional Buddhist societies that the texts are one monolithic block and that there is no contradiction there, and that that there is no contradiction. But then when we read the actual text, instead of just believing that, then we see that it's full of contradictions, and somehow we have to make sense of that. So I think it's much better to actually start exploring and to try to find answers, because by that we will actually advance our knowledge instead of just blindly believing that there are no differences, because then we will never develop any kind of knowledge. So it's better to walk on the path and try to find out instead of just giving up from the start. That's my approach, but I know other people do things differently.
No, I think what you're saying is so important, and it's so good to hear it said. And I think we need to say it more and more. We talk about, like, to practice takes a tremendous amount of insight and nuance and attention to detail of the mind. And I think if we put the same kind of effort and the nuance and sophistication to study and not just accept everything blindly, and also not just say, I can't do it, it's too complicated, but to sit down and really do the work, which is what you're suggesting, and really try to figure it out. And we may make mistakes and we might be wrong on certain occasions, but to make that effort to try to understand the history of the tradition and have that sophistication changes everything, right? It makes the difference between fundamentalism and a lived, exciting tradition that is investigating.
Yeah,
and so
exactly.
I think your answer is right. And I'm so excited to, you know, and I think that's why these classes are so important, right? It's encouraging us to keep studying and trying to figure it out. I think you're right.
Thank you. I see that Dana put a question into the chat. What reasons they gave for saying that Ananda was wrong in regard to starting the female sangha? In the Mahāpajāpatī Sutta, Buddha said he intended to establish fourfold assembly or sangha, and his task was then done. Yes, exactly. Exactly, Dana. That is basically one point why we see that Mahāpajāpatī Sutta belongs to the earlier text, and the council belongs to a somewhat later kind of text, because there is the discrepancy there. The later texts support the Bhikkhuni Sangha, and there are other suttas. There's one in the Majjhima Nikaya where the wanderer Vacchagotta comes to the Buddha, and he asks him if in the Buddha's teaching there are even one single bhikkhuni who has actually walked the path and attained arahantship. And the Buddha says, well, not only one, we have more than 500 bhikkhunis who have done that. And then the wanderer Vacchagotta says, rejoices, and he says, well, if there were no bhikkhunis that were accomplished, then your teaching would be deficient. But because the bhikkhunis are there, that's why in that respect your teaching is complete. So that Vacchagotta at that point wasn't even Buddhist. He was just a random wanderer, like a general member of society. And that was just the prevalent opinion at the time, that women need to have the same opportunities, and that a teaching that doesn't offer opportunities to women is deficient. So the text doesn't actually give any reasons for saying that why Ananda was wrong. The text, we have just read the text. There is nothing, I haven't hidden anything from the text. The text is as it is. So we are left to wonder what's going on. And probably the monks at that time thought it was self-explanatory. As I said, if the text was actually finalized 100 years after the Buddha, that would have been at a time when the status of women in society would have been lower than what it was at the Buddha's time. So at that point, it might have been self-explanatory that women should not have the same opportunities that men have. So maybe the council didn't feel any need to go into more detail at that point. Okay, if there are no more questions, then maybe we will finish for today. I have two more announcements to make. One is a huge thank you to the Rain Bodhi group in Sydney. They are allowing us to use their Zoom account. So because they are generous, we can have this course today and the next few weeks. So Rain Bodhi is a Buddhist group for LGBTQIA+ people and their allies. They are in Sydney and they're hosting regular events. And I just want to say thank you so much for helping us out. And the other thing that I wanted to say, if what we have discussed today was interesting for you, I am teaching another course, which is called The Transition Years. And that is a sutta study course where we're only going to read suttas. And we are going to talk about the preparations of the Buddha and the Sangha for the Buddha's parinibbana, and then his actual parinibbana, and then how the Sangha developed in the years and decades after that, by reading suttas of the Pali canon. And that course will start tomorrow, and it will be on every Tuesday at the same time as this meeting today. So in whatever time zone you are, whatever time you came today, it will be the same time tomorrow. and it will be not on Zoom, that will be on YouTube, on the Buddhist Insights YouTube channel. So if you're interested, you can join there. But anyway, it's not, this course is a standalone course here. So if you don't want to join the other course, that's also fine. You don't have to, they don't have much to do with each other. Oh, I promised, I actually just remember that I promised you to put the links in the chat. So I'll just quickly do that. So these are two links for the first council narrative and for the Mahāpajāpatī Apadāna. And I will also put the Buddhist Insights channel. You can search it on YouTube and it's easy to find. Okay, and then we can finish up for today with 3 sadhus. So if you want to join, please join in. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And see you all next time.